This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today, we are discussing with Minxin Pei his latest book, China's Crony, Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay. Professor Pei is the author of two books, one From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in the Soviet Union and China, and China's Trapped Transition. He is the Tom and Margot Pritzker Professor of Government and Roberts Fellow and Director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies at Claremont McKenna College. Professor Pei, glad to have you on the program.
Thank you.
So the title of your book, China's Crony Capitalism, that's a term we've heard a lot about in America, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis. Interesting to hear it applied to China. So maybe here at the beginning, sketch for us crony capitalism in China.
Well, crony capitalism exists around the world, but this phenomenon in China has very special characteristics. In most other countries, crony capitalism involves well-established capitalists and the political elites. In China, crony capitalism began with no such class of well-established capitalists. You would have a few entrepreneurs, but a lot of the crony capitalists in China today are somehow connected with the political elites, either through bloodlines or through illicit relationships such as bribe giving and taking.
So within China, this level of corruption, you say, is endemic. And indeed, so pervasive, infecting so many sectors of Chinese government, of local governments, of the judiciary, of the administrative part of the government, and then throughout the economy. You use the term, it's corruption indicative of late-stage decay. That's a bold claim. Talk about that.
Oh, yes. I think corruption in China today exhibits some very worrisome, depending on your point of view. If you want the Communist Party to crash tomorrow, then these are very encouraging signs. But if you are the Communist Party's leadership, then these are very worrisome signs. So what are the signs of decay? There are different kinds of corruption, but the corruption in China we see today can be indicative of late-stage decay. One sign is that it involves collusion, that it is not individual theft or bribe-taking. We see an entire government, the most important officials involved in the corruption scandal. To give you an example of this, what I might call networked corruption or corruption networks, had an equivalent scandal occurred in the U.S. This would have involved the governor, the Speaker of the House, the Attorney General, the Supreme Court Justice, or the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, Lieutenant Governor, heads of EPA, all the major agencies. So it's like entire government is corrupt, and that means that officials in that system no longer have any loyalty to the system. They are only loyal to each other, to small groups. Another sign of decay is that the amount of money being stolen is mind-boggling. China is still a middle-income country. Per capita income is about 1/5 of the U.S. So any amount I mention will have to be multiplied by a factor of 5 to give an average American listener an idea. So based on the studies I've done in this book, and the average amount of the money stolen by an official at the county level. A county in China is about 500,000 people, so that's about the equivalent of a congressional district. The average amount is about 6 million Chinese yuan. That's about $1 million US. So if you multiply that by 5, that's $5 million just in average bribe. And that's another sign of greed and decay. And the third sign of decay is that you see government officials getting involved with organized crime. We're not talking about just law enforcement officials, and that there's a chapter in the book that details how law enforcement officials are colluding with organized crime. We're talking about very senior Chinese government officials whose children or who themselves are implicated in scandals that involved organized crime. So these are just three very obvious signs of regime decay. And when I say late stage regime decay, is that typically when you this kind of corruption occurs in history right before the fall of a very corrupt regime.
So I come to this subject matter obviously very much a sort of an introductory level understanding here. Something that has been written about in Wall Street Journal op-eds, various magazines and journals, I think relates to what you're describing here. Chinese elite officials, both in business or in government, coming to America with their children or with their family members, or obtaining citizenship or buying property here. Is this related in certain respects to what you're talking about, or maybe an outcome that is certain people who have done very well by this system making their next move? Or preparing for their next move. That was one thought I had listening to you talk about what's going on.
Oh yes, I think I'm so glad you raised this point. If you have to come up with the fourth characteristic of late-stage regime decay, that is the flight by its officials abroad. So you will see officials fleeing, elites fleeing China for safe haven, because the analogy is that it's like rats escaping a sinking ship. So I'm not at all surprised that corrupt officials are leaving China, and oftentimes they would come to the U.S. because the U.S. does not have an extradition treaty with China, and they come here, they find safe haven. And of course, that poses a very serious problem for the American law enforcement authorities. These people obviously do not belong here. The U.S. should not give them any kind of safe haven, but these people exploit the loopholes in American legal system, and they come here with the right visas, with the right paperwork, and they can stay. So that's the problem I think the U.S. has right now. But as I said, as long as China has a very serious corruption problem at home, those who are in a position to benefit from corruption in China will inevitably find a safe haven. And coming to the U.S. is a very logical thing for them to do. But coming here, they actually pollute the U.S. because their money is dirty. They come here, they buy big houses, they live an ostentatious life, and just in terms of sense of justice, that is really jarring to see this kind of people flaunting international law, flaunting American law, and their crimes do not get punished.
Well, it's interesting too. The point has also been made with regard to certain members of the Russian elite proceeding in sort of a similar manner. A term you used, I think you've been implicating it in some of your comments here, collusive corruption inside Chinese government entities in the country. Talk about that, because you say it's this collusive corruption that accelerated dramatically after the Tiananmen Square massacre, and it was used as a way to bond Communist Party members to one another and to the party in a post-ideological phase.
Oh, yeah. I became interested in this subject when I noticed terms in Chinese referring to collusion. So I did a word check, keyword search on Chinese websites that have publications dating way back to the 80s and late 70s, and I could not find this term. But after 1990, this term became quite frequent, the use of this term. So I began to look more carefully, and what I found was truly revealing is that before Tiananmen 89, corruption in China involved individuals who did not collaborate or cooperate with one another. But after 1989, more and more officials began to collude or plot or conspire with each other, and they engage in all kinds of illegal, illicit activities, such as bribe taking, theft, mostly bribe taking. And so I began to ask, why would they do this? And I came to this conclusion is that after 1989, the Chinese government began to allow private entrepreneurs or just everybody to somehow gain control of state assets, land, mineral resources, or factory assets. And as a result, these officials found it to their advantage to form small groups so that they can work together. They could work together and gain control of such valuable assets. So this was in a way, this is quite similar to Russia's privatization, because Russia privatized in the early 90s, and that created a lot of theft. The only difference is that in China, the object of the theft is land, mine, mineral resources, and factory assets. In Russia, it's mostly mineral resources. And in Russia, you could control vast quantities of wealth relatively easily because it's owned by one corporation. In China, that's different. China's crony capitalism is much more decentralized because a lot of officials are involved. So you don't see the equivalent of Russian tycoons in China, but you do see a lot of mini versions of those tycoons in China.
This question, there's a property rights point lurking in your analysis. You make it definitively in the book. That is, in this realm, post-Tiananmen, I take it, property rights, were seen and understood to provide incentives for people to get involved and be productive in the economy, yet they were split, or they were left ambiguous and unclear as to who held ultimate title. And so government officials would hold the nominal title, and yet effective control and use of state assets would devolve to various private actors, know-how, et cetera. But that sort of created the opportunities you talk about for graft. Could you talk at some specificity about that? Because as I read your book, that's what really stuck out to my mind was nobody really knows who holds the property rights, and because of that, there's untold opportunity for corruption. As you can imagine, you hold the ultimate title as a government manager, and that gives you the ways, the means to offer it up for endless side payments for yourself as you deal with market actors.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Property rights have two parts. One is control rights. The other is ownership rights. In the case of China, the government, starting in the 1990s, wanted to make property more productive. And if the state controls both, if the state owns both the ownership rights and control rights, then property does not get utilized efficiently. But the state does not want to give up ownership. So what happened in China is that the government decentralized control rights. For example, it used to be the case that nobody could effectively manage a state-owned enterprise without a lot of authority. And the government, any decision to dispose of a piece of property or to conduct transactions will have to be proved at a much higher level. So starting in the 1990s, the government said, we're going to decentralize. So a little factory manager who couldn't even do anything under the old system now has the ability to sell a piece of machinery, to sell a piece of the factory, because now he has the ability to dispose property. But the irony here is that the government never specified who actually owns a piece of property. Because in nominal terms, everything is owned by the state. But we all know when the state owns something, in reality, nobody owns it.
Yeah.
Because the state is not a person. Property, the most secure property is a property that has a real individual owner. So with this system, as I say, it's decentralization of control without clarifying ownership, which means that a lot of people can now steal property that nobody owns.
Yeah.
So it's really a paradise for low-level officials to enrich themselves. But there is a catch here. That is, there are a lot of low-level officials who have power now and who clearly know what they can steal. But because a lot of them want the same piece of property they want to steal, they can block each other. Because, as I said, nobody really owns this. So they can use political means, they can use bureaucratic means to prevent other people from stealing. If I cannot steal it, nobody else can steal it. So the optimal outcome for these officials is to form an alliance, form a network. That is, either we steal this together, then we split the receipts. Or this time you steal this piece, next time I get this piece. So this kind of horse trading or collusion gradually became the norm throughout China. And that is how crony capitalism began in China. It began with the opportunity to steal a massive amount of government property.
So how does this relate then? I mean, a lot of stories in American press, as you know, about infrastructure spending in China and tremendous government debts being accumulated throughout various entities in China, government entities. I suppose this all relates and fits together.
Oh yes, I think the infrastructure story is slightly different because that involved government contracts, huge amounts, because China spends something like 11% of its GDP on infrastructure every year. So we're talking about $1.1 trillion.
Wow.
So if you can get just 10%, because normally 10% of the infrastructure spending on government contract is paid in bribes. So that's $110 billion every year going to a very relatively small number of people. But so where, again, based on my study, where most of the theft has occurred involves land. Because in China, land is very scarce commodity. And land is used both for infrastructure, but more importantly, for commercial and residential housing. That's where land price can rise overnight 10, 15 times. So literally, somebody who has absolutely no money, but who knows an official who can give him a piece of land can become overnight a multimillionaire.
So I read these pieces about massive condominium apartment blocks being built throughout China, no renters, or
Oh, yes.
or that it's vacant.
Yes.
So this also would relate and fit in.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because the profitability, if they succeed, is gigantic. And for a long time, I think those who got into the game earlier in this process became fabulously rich. China's wealthiest person today began in the real estate, with commercial and real estate and residential housing. Today he's now getting into entertainment, football.
Yeah.
But those who got into the game late are now stuck with this gigantic real estate bubble, ghost towns, ghost apartment blocks. But the origin is the same, is that there was this huge potential for making an overnight fortune, mainly because they could get a piece of property from the government at very low cost.
I suppose, though, in thinking about your point there, who bears the losses? I mean, I suppose private players, whatever that means, they win in the upside, but are they able, in effect, to shield themselves from real losses throughout the economy? I guess that's more a general question to entertain.
Yeah, I think three kinds of people pay. The first group to pay are Chinese farmers who own the land, or who till the land, who do not own.
Okay.
Because the government owns the land. So if the government takes a piece of land from them, they get very little compensation in between. So they get this sort of a huge. They're stuck with this huge loss because they could have sold the land at much higher price. So that's one. The second group who pay are urban residents who have to pay very high prices for apartments. So the irony about China's real estate bubble is that on the one hand, you have ghost towns after ghost towns. At the same time, overall, Chinese real estate prices are very high. So it's like a tax on ordinary Chinese people who want to buy a house. The third group of people would be everybody in China, because this real estate bubble has created a gigantic debt burden on China. So if a real estate developer goes under, the bank gets stuck with bad debts, and the Chinese people, taxpayers, have to bail the bank out. So that's those three groups of people.
Yeah, no, I was wondering that as I was reading your book and thinking, what crony capitalism, inevitably one element of it, at least in Western democracies, and this is what drove the American people crazy, I think, both about the auto bailouts and the bank bailouts, was that people in the market who were playing weren't actually bearing the cost of their bad decisions. It was being put on the taxpayers. And thinking about that with regard to what the situation you described in China, I wanted to ask you a different question. You open the book with a quotation from Xi Jinping, the current general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, on his anti-corruption efforts, which began in 2012 and have been much more extensive, you argue, than people were predicting. And indeed, he's gone after really the elites within the party, 5,000 or so senior officials that have been targeted. Many have gone to jail. Some have received death sentences or suspended death sentences. But my question for you is, what's been the result of all that? Now it's 2016. What's come out of that?
I think two outcomes. The first one is that, at least temporarily, corruption has been curbed. That is, the ruling elites have got his message that this leadership is quite serious about cracking down on corruption. So my analogy is that my analysis is this: is that the anti-corruption campaign has not really solved the underlying problem of corruption, because it does not go after what is causing corruption. For instance, this campaign has not mandated that every official has to declare his or her assets. it does not take the government out of the control of the economy. Because if the government is not in control of the economy, there's going to be much less corruption. Because political power is not very valuable in economic terms. So on these two, and then third is that if you want to fight corruption, you have to allow the press a lot of freedom. And the current government is doing the opposite, cracking down on the press. So that's why I think corruption has been curbed, but the underlying causes are still there. So what has happened in China, and here's my analogy, and I think it's quite appropriate, is that the current government has simply frozen transactions, suspending trading in the stock market for corruption. So the demand and supply for corruption are still there. But because of the campaign, nobody is doing any trading with each other. Those have favors to sell, those who want to buy favors. So as soon as the campaign is over, corruption will come back. The other outcome is that this anti-corruption campaign has served the interests of the top leader, Xi Jinping, really well, because this allows him to consolidate power, to purge his rivals, and then to gain some measure of public support, because the Chinese people are really sick and tired of corruption. So to use the Chinese proverb, you kill two birds with one stone. And this is what I think has happened in the last 4 years.
So you make the point in the book that Xi Jinping is really protected in many respects by public opinion, because with regard to the ruling elite, he's actually in a precarious position. And you note he's in a precarious position because what's holding the Communist Party together? As you've noted earlier in this interview, it's not public spiritedness or any sort of loyalty to national honor or national interest. It's to private gain, and it's not to communist ideology. It's to what has been happening the last 20 or 25 years, this sort of wealth creation through politics and economics. And he's an enemy, or he has positioned himself against that in certain respects. So that in and of itself makes his position difficult. It would seem to me, but I guess it's opinion carrying him right now.
Yeah, I think two things. I think that are protecting him. One is he obviously enjoys a measure of public support, as I said. The other is that he controls the secret police. He controls the anti-corruption body, which is really a secret police inside the Communist Party. He controls the army. So his opponents cannot do a thing about him, even though I have to say that the current bureaucracy, the rank and file, the majority of Communist Party officials really dislike his campaign. His campaign has ended the post-Tiananmen system of sharing spoils among the ruling elites. And Xi Jinping really does not want that to continue. But, of course, this is a zero-sum game. And those who have paid in this anti-corruption campaign are the ruling elites themselves. So right now he's in a precarious position because he's very unpopular with a very large number of Communist Party officials.
Something, just listening to you right now, and I want to be careful and not range too widely in my observations. As you know, conventional American opinion has the economic growth took off in China. China would democratize. China would become a rule of law country, a member of the family of nations, and all of this. Your book really is almost saying no to that. If I'm making sort of an appropriate comparison and observation, your book seems to be suggesting there is no imminent or easy path to a separation of the government and society, to rule of law, to representative government. There's something really corrosive within China, and there's been dramatic economic growth in China for 20 years. I mean, massive growth. even that's slowing down now. By what measure, I'm not exactly sure, but most people think that it is. So, just sort of putting all this together, I mean, this is really, your book is kind of a downer for conventional American opinion. Have you received any sort of pushback or comments on that?
No, actually not yet, because it's so interesting. I'm right now working on another book which explores the likelihood and the potential scenarios of a regime transition in China. The relationship between economic development and the emergence of democratic system is really complex. It's not linear. It does not say that if you have $1 increase in wealth, you're going to increase the probability of having a democracy by 1%. It doesn't work that way. That is, in the case of China, that is what has happened in the last 27 years since Tiananmen, is that in the short term, economic growth will actually help the authoritarian one-party state stay in power for the following reasons. One is that it obviously gives the party some performance legitimacy. People are happy, bread on the table, more jobs. Second is more wealth also makes power more valuable, and ruling elites are less willing to give up power because now political power can turn themselves into billionaires. So why give up power and their children into billionaires? And third is that with economic resources, they can maintain a very large secret police. They can install video cameras in every building, on every street lamp post to monitor the people. So its repressive capacity has grown tremendously. So in the short term, economic wealth can be very bad for democracy. But in the longer term, and I think we're about to see this inflection point, that is, economic development can bring down a dictatorship in the following ways. Is that because a dictatorship is inherently a group of thieves. They are predators. We call them predatory regimes. So they, under a dictatorship, economic growth cannot be sustained. So the middle class or the Chinese people will always be disappointed. And we're seeing this happening right now. Economic growth is slowing down. Of course, there are cyclical reasons, but I suspect there are also institutional reasons. That is, the system simply extracts too much wealth from society. So that's one reason. So the other reason is that social change nevertheless happens. You will have a lot more and well-educated people, and they really want something more from their government. So expectations will grow, not just for economic improvement, but for political opportunities and political voice. So if you plot China, if you plug in the numbers for China and see where China is now relative to those countries that became democratic in the last, say, 40 years, China actually is very close in terms of economic data, socioeconomic indicators, health, education, or per capita income. So I think that is probably in the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see a very dramatic change in the political system in China.
So maybe your book isn't such a downer.
No, well, the late regime decay, because decay is good for democratic transition. Because you need, whenever the authoritarian ruling elites are unified, are coherent, have a sense of purpose, then this kind of system is very durable. But when you have a regime that is split within, that has its members all engaged in theft from the government, that kind of regime is very fragile.
No,
So
good point.
Regime transition has to be preceded by a period of decay. The late Soviet period, I hope you or whatever your listeners will just take a look at China and take a look at the Brezhnev period. There are striking similarities.
Oh, interesting comparison. I know your book is about institutional dynamics and corruption, and very technical. One question that I'm interested in is, some people have said China will grow old before it grows wealthy. Could you comment on the population demography situation in China?
Oh yeah, China is the beneficiary of something called demographic dividend. That is, when China began to develop, its population structure was very favorable to rapid economic takeoff because it had a very large group of young people and very small group of retirees. I think the ratio is something like 7 or 8 to 1. Today, the ratio that is gone. Today, the ratio is about 3 to 1, and soon it will become 2 to 1. So that means that China will spend a lot of money on healthcare, on pensions, and labor costs will go up significantly. And China's rise is made possible by low-cost labor. Mm-hmm. And that advantage is disappearing. I think most probably has already gone. That's why China is no longer a low-cost producer in the world anymore. Its wages are actually higher than in Mexico, than in Indonesia, Vietnam, India. So it will have to move up the value chain. But China is still middle-income country. China is not a wealthy country. That's why it will be, if you look at current trends, China will not become truly wealthy. That is, per capita income in China today, in terms of purchasing power, is about $12,000. U.S. is about 50 plus. So U.S. is about at least 4 times richer, or twice as richer than China. So if China become twice as rich as it is today, so we're talking about 2030. And by 2030, China will be an aging society.
Okay. How does that factor in to the democratic analysis? I wonder.
Democratic analysis.
And the economic growth analysis for China under an aging society.
Aging society, yeah. I think one certain, or 2 certain outcomes. One is that economic growth will be a lot lower than it is today. Right now, the government reports 6.5, 6.7. The real number is probably around 4%. So if China, in 15 years, China's aging structure will be like Japan 5 years ago. And China is still only less than half as wealthy as Japan, then I think the government will lose a lot of popular support because this is not a government that can deliver. Yes. And then its budget situation will become really terrifying because China has not set aside real money and investments to take care of its fast aging population. So let me just give you an example. So if by the time China, let's say 20% of Chinese population will be retirees, then we're talking about something like 300 million people, the entire U.S., the size of the U.S., who have to be paid a pension, who have to somehow enjoy health care protection. And that's a huge drain on the government budget.
Yeah. A question here for you, and I don't know, just thinking about kind of conventional American thinking, China being maybe a competitive partner with America and sort of geopolitical tactics and strategy. But how does sort of your analysis on the nature of the current ruling regime in China factor into its geopolitical ambitions, which have many people commented on this sort of the strident moves in the South China Sea recently by the Chinese Navy and other the One Belt One Road move as well. All of that sort of seems to, in some way, in my mind, factor into what you're describing.
Yeah. I think when you look at this relationship in the short to medium term, we're talking about 5 to 10 years. There will be a period of rising tensions, rising competition, rivalry. That's because as its economic performance deteriorates, the Chinese Communist Party wants to play the nationalism card. That is, it wants to show to the Chinese people that it is defending their dignity, honor, and there is this country out there, the U.S., that wants to contain China. And that narrative has actually been very effective in convincing the Chinese people. So if you look at the latest Pew survey in China, more than half of the Chinese people believe that the U.S. wants to contain China. And that can provide some sort of support for the regime. That is, the regime can tell the Chinese people, well, our economy is not doing very well, but that's not our fault. That's the fault of the Americans. So that will at least buy the regime some time. But the unfortunate aspect is that it will create persistent tensions and problems with the U.S. But this is a self-defeating tactic because the U.S. is China's most important economic partner. And if this kind of geopolitical competition gets really serious and really ugly, then China will have to pay an economic price for this. So as a result, rising tensions will inevitably undermine U.S.-China trading relationship. And that in turn will undermine China's economic performance. So if you look 10, 15 years out, actually playing the nationalism card will boomerang against Beijing. It will lead to even worse economic performance. And that eventually will undermine the party's rule inside China.
Another sort of broad question for you. Maybe this can be our last one. Interested on your thoughts here. So you've described a communist party in China no longer believing in its purpose or central ideological purpose that obviously formed it, and replacing that with the private pursuit of money by those officials. Talk about what would replace the Communist Party in China. What sort of unwritten foundation, legitimacy, social legitimacy for a government, ruling values, etc., would replace that in a China after the decay that you describe?
Well, ideally, liberal democratic values, but that's going to be very difficult. Right now, the current government...
I guess the question would be liberal democratic values interacting with or building on, I guess I'm just speculating here, something traditional in Chinese culture, civilization.
Yes, I think you might have to marry Confucianism with liberal democracy, a very difficult thing to do, but probably doable, that you find bits and pieces in ancient Chinese philosophy, Chinese culture that would support the idea of individual values, rights, and democratic procedures. But it's hard. Right now, the current Chinese Communist Party is trying to revive its ideology. And you can see bits and pieces of this new ideology. One bit, as I said, it's Chinese nationalism, that we're a great nation, we want to stand tall in the world. The other is ancient Chinese culture. So Confucian, which was reviled by Mao Zedong many, many years ago, is now being trotted out to legitimize the current system. So it's and then third is strangely some aspects of Maoism, populism and so forth. So it's really a very strange mix right now. There's no intellectual coherence in this, but then the government is trying anyway.
Anything that will stick.
Yes, of course.
Professor Pei, thank you so much for your time. We've been talking with Professor Minxin Pei about his latest book, China's Crony Capitalism, just published by Harvard University Press. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.